Breaking news, the Panasonic GH5 Mark II has leaked. We're going to talk about what that means to the Micro Four Thirds community to have a new video-centric camera. Will this be the perfect vlogging camera? I'm also going to compare it against the A7S Mark III and talk about what this means for the future of the GH6 that we've all been waiting for. But first, a word from our sponsor, Squarespace. Squarespace makes incredible websites incredibly easy. Drag and drop some pictures in, write a few words about yourself, and you can have a beautiful, fully functioning website. The designs are so amazing that it's perfect for a photography or videography portfolio, but it's also perfect for restaurants, law offices, whatever type of business you might imagine. I even keep up several for different personal projects. If you want to set up any type of website, head to squarespace.com/Tony. Try it out, and if you love it, use the coupon code TONY and get 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace. First, a little history lesson. We started out this studio with Panasonic GH2s and eventually upgraded to the GH3, the GH4, the GH5, and even the GH5S. But then in 2019, I think, we switched everything over to Canon. And now we shoot on a mix of Canon and Sony full frame cameras. So we actually left the Panasonic lineup behind, but we are intensely familiar with it. I think when we sold our gear, we had something like 45 Micro Four Thirds lenses. In March 2017, Panasonic launched the GH5, and that was a big deal for us because we upgraded to it right away. It offered 4K at 60 frames per second video, which was class leading. Nobody else was doing that. It had a flip forward screen, all these amazing capabilities that really let us take our channel up to the next level. It was $2,000 brand new, and actually that was expensive at the time. Camera prices have gotten so inflated that, the $3,900 Canon R5 doesn't seem so bad, but $2,000 was a lot at the time. Nowadays they're selling for about $1,300 brand new, or you could pick a used one up at KEH, sdp.io/KEH, for $1,059 in excellent condition with a warranty. So that gives you a baseline. It's been over 4 years since the release of the previous iteration of the camera. Now for the actual rumors coming from Nokashita via 43rumors.com. It's not for a GH6, it's for a GH5 Mark II. Now there was no GH4 Mark II, no GH3 Mark II. Every other release of this particular camera, Panasonic just incremented to the next number. The manufacturer might choose to do a Mark II instead of a GH6 because they're indicating this is not a major update. Think of it as a way for them to control expectations. In fact, there are lots of things that might be disappointing, like this still seems to have the same 20 megapixel sensor. I know so many Micro Four Thirds users have been waiting for higher megapixel sensors and eventually just given up and left the system if they want a little bit more detail. The rumors also say that it's also limited to 4K at 60 frames per second at a time when we have cameras like the Canon R5, the Sony A7S Mark III, the Sony Alpha 1, more expensive cameras, but they all shoot 4K 120. That's kind of leading edge now. It shows you that it's no longer a leading edge camera. The viewfinder is also the same and also pretty low end at 3.68 million dots. Cameras like the more expensive A7S Mark III have more than 9 million dots, and you see that. The viewfinder actually is more crisp, and it's really useful for making sure that you get focus. The rumors also say that it's going to have an S5 battery, one of the few things that has changed. So you will not be able to use your GH5 batteries in the GH5 Mark II, but you will get 20-25% more milliamp hours. Battery life was never a huge problem on the GH5, but we always appreciate a little more recording time out of it. The weight and dimensions seem to be about the same, and the price is going to be $1,700. So less expensive than the GH5 originally launched at, despite things like inflation and chip shortages, but more expensive than the GH5 is currently selling for, especially when you factor in used prices. You'll also be able to get a $2,300 kit with the 12 to 60 millimeter lens. Now, those are the leaked specs, but I can infer a lot. Knowing Panasonic, they're going to advertise improved autofocus using their depth from defocus, DFD, algorithm. I think this because literally every camera that launches Panasonic is like, we got DFD worked out. We have contrast AF, and I know people want phase detect AF, but now we finally cracked it, and this is great. And when we reviewed the Panasonic S5, their full-frame camera with a flip-forward screen, actually very similar to the GH5 in many ways, we found indeed the autofocus algorithm had gotten great. We found it outperformed the Sony A7S III for tasks like still portraits. However, when it came to video, the autofocus algorithm still really lagged behind. Tasks like this, talking head, me talking to a camera with shallow depth of field, it really wasn't able to accurately track autofocus on my eye as I moved forward and back. Still subjects, it could do pretty well, but as soon as there was any kind of movement, it lost it. But nonetheless, it was great at stills. I expect those algorithm and processing changes to trickle down to the GH5. I think that'll be the biggest change. Better software, higher performance processor. One of the rumors said that the EVF would be at 120 frames per second, and that's good. But that also indicates to me that the processors in the camera are probably reading out the data more often, and given Panasonic's contrast-based algorithm, that extra readout speed is going to do a lot to improve the autofocus. Are vloggers going to be satisfied with this? I mean, we'll have to wait and see, right? Subscribe, because we'll review it as soon as it's launched. I hope that I can say this is the Micro Four Thirds camera that we've all been waiting for. I also want to proactively address the numerous comments that I'm going to get saying real filmmakers don't need autofocus, they use focus pullers. And that is largely true. If you watch The Handmaid's Tale, a fantastic show with amazing cinematography, from what I can find, they shoot on RE 4K cameras, and they tend to use close-up shots with extraordinarily shallow depth of field locked on the eye. And these RE cameras don't have sophisticated eye autofocus that you see in Canon and Sony cameras, so they're probably using a dedicated focus puller, but they're probably also doing a bunch of different takes. They have somebody highly skilled just turning a dial to lock the focus in, but they also have trained actors who learn to emote, like have feelings without moving outside of the focal plane. And The Handmaid's Tale does a great job of this type of tracking, but if you watch a movie like Inception, you'll see a lot of those shallow depth of field shots miss focus, especially as the actor moves a little bit. You'll see the focus kind of lags behind. That is something that is solved in the latest gear from Canon and Sony with their sophisticated phase detect eye autofocus system. So you're right, real filmmakers don't need this because they have figured out ways to lock autofocus on the eye pretty reliably. But as this technology automates these things, it means that real filmmakers could get a similar or better job done without that extra staff there. They could get it done perhaps with fewer takes. It also means that real filmmakers, serious filmmakers on a lower budget, could get it done with lower end gear. And so that's why I think video autofocus has become such an important differentiator with every single new video camera release. That's a big part of why so many creators like ourselves switched away from Panasonic and over to Canon and Sony. A few other guesses from me. I think it'll have sensor stabilization. I think it'll offer 4K at 60 frames per second at 422 10-bit, which just means you have a little more room for deep color grading for things like recovering shadows. The GH5 only offers 10-bit 422 at 4K 30, so that would be an improvement. I also think it'll definitely offer raw video externally, but I'm hoping it'll offer it internally because that alone might be a good reason to upgrade. When we do shoot with the Canon R5's raw video, the workflow is so great and the video quality is so much better than things like the C-Log or V-Log, logarithmic but still highly compressed formats. So you just get to recover more and everything looks a lot smoother. So the GH5 Mark II is coming. They didn't call it the GH6 because they didn't want our expectations to be high, but also they wanted to leave room for the GH6. Here's a comparison to Nikon. Nikon launched the Nikon D5, their top-end sports camera, a few years back. Every other iteration went Nikon D3, Nikon D3S, Nikon D4, Nikon D4S, Nikon D5, Nikon D6. There was no Nikon D5S. All of the other S upgrades were minor incremental updates. The D5, D6 update was minor and incremental. So why did Nikon decide not to call it the D5S? My theory was that this was going to be the final sports DSLR, that at least according to their plans at the time. They didn't intend to release another one, and thus they didn't want to call their last DSLR a D5S because they wanted to cash in and encourage, if even mislead, existing D5 owners into thinking that this was a major upgrade as opposed to an incremental upgrade. Panasonic is not doing that. And I think they're leaving room for the GH6 probably in the next year or two. The GH6 faces some serious challenges. After the release of the Canon R5 and the Sony Alpha 1 as 8K cameras, people are going to expect this video-centric camera to finally have 8K. Now, there is a prototype of an 8K camera in circulation, the Sharp 8K camera. They announced that 8K camera in 2019, I think, and it never made it to market. They never officially canceled it either. They even had it in the hands of reviewers. They just never launched it. And to me, that means a couple of different things. One, maybe it simply didn't work well enough. Maybe it was overheating. Maybe the processing was just too much. Maybe they determined that there wasn't a market out there for a high-end, expensive 8K camera in the Micro Four Thirds world. Another possibility is that 8K Micro Four Thirds sensors were either not available or were such a high price that it didn't allow the camera to be at a marketable price point. Sony does make a Micro Four Thirds sensor that Panasonic or Sharp could buy and implement, I think, but we don't know what those prices are or if they're readily available. Another major barrier to launching an 8K Micro Four Thirds camera could be the lens quality. Micro Four Thirds cameras have always been lower megapixel, like 16 megapixels, 20 megapixels. When Olympus launched the EM5 Mark II, it came with a unique sensor shift feature that's now kind of commonplace, but at the time was really novel. And we really put it through its paces. It would allow you to take, I think, 80 megapixel pictures with those Micro Four Thirds lenses, and the results we got were pretty disappointing. What we actually learned was that most Micro Four Thirds lenses available at that time, a few years back, didn't have the sharpness to handle a high megapixel sensor. They just didn't produce that much more detail despite having so many more megapixels captured. Now, there were exceptions to it. We found some excellent lenses, but those day-to-day zooms that photographers and videographers used, none of them were up to the quality we required for a high megapixel sensor. And as we built out our own studio, we discovered that too. Our 4K studio never looked that good until we switched from Micro Four Thirds lenses over to adapted Sigma APS-C lenses with a speed booster. That gave us the sharpness that we were craving. The bodies were capable, but the lenses just were not there. And let me emphasize, we owned more than 40 lenses. We tested so many different lenses just trying to get sharp results. Now let's quickly compare the GH5 Mark II to Sony's A7S Mark III. This is a wildly unfair comparison, but we currently shoot with the A7S Mark III. It has become the dream vlogging camera for those of us with big YouTube channels. The GH5 Mark II is going to be $1,700, whereas the A7S Mark III is twice that at $3,500. A7S Mark III, full frame camera, whole lineup of Sony lenses, lots of options for shallow depth of field. The GH5 Mark II, smaller and lighter, probably better sensor stabilization. They will both shoot at 4K at 60 frames per second with 422 10-bit, I think. However, the A7S Mark III will also do that at 120 frames per second. That gives filmmakers the option of doing slow motion, which is an easy way to create kind of cool effects. I think they'll both have sensor stabilization, but I think the GH5 Mark IIs might be a little bit better. The A7S Mark III will do RAW externally, and I would bet the GH5 Mark II will do that too, though we don't have that confirmed by the rumors. I think the biggest difference is going to be the autofocus. I expect the GH5 Mark II to have the DFD contrast-based system. We'll have to wait until it comes out and put it side by side with other cameras, but I'm going to be shocked if it keeps up with the phase detect system from the Sony. I wanted to see what people in the Micro Four Thirds community thought of this, and it's pretty shocking. People are really upset. So let's go over some highlights from the comments on this post on 43rumors.com. Armin Arlert says, if that's not a solid proof that R&D is at a halt in the Micro Four Thirds world, I don't know what is. Goodbye, fellow Micro Four Thirds users. Let's all move to the L mount or the E mount from Sony. See you there. Erlen Strom says, Panasonic wants to make money while trying to persuade their customer base to switch to L mount. They will therefore only offer minor upgrades in their Micro Four Thirds lineup. Yeah, I've thought that too. Anonymous reviewer says, wow, this makes me feel angry. They cannot give away L mount bodies and we get this garbage. Michael Shagan says, this is it. Final stop for Micro Four Thirds. Everyone get off the bus, please. As you can see, this sort of underwhelming announcement is feeling like the nail in the coffin for a lot of Micro Four Thirds users who've been patiently waiting for the high megapixel 8K body to finally come around. The camera market continues to shrink thanks to the amazing popularity of smartphones and their constantly improving video and stills capabilities. They are small, light, compact, and portable, and that was also Micro Four Thirds market share. While the market is shrinking, we also have more competitors joining the fight. And that means everybody either needs to eat a smaller piece of the pie or some of the competitors need to leave the table. Canon and Nikon both offer $999 full-frame mirrorless cameras. And that means that Micro Four Thirds isn't the only budget option anymore. You can get 4 times the sensor size at similar price points. We've also seen with the Canon R5, R6, and Sony Alpha 1 breakthroughs in frames per second, readout speeds, and autofocus capabilities that leave all of the competitors from all of the brands in the dust. And Canon and Sony are clearly investing the most to push through this. I'm not sure other competitors can invest enough to keep up with their R&D. This isn't the film era, where you just had to make a mechanical body and the sensor was whatever roll of film that you bought. No, there's so much more engineering work that needs to go into each camera, and the cameras themselves need to be much more expensive. And that engineering work can be shared across a company's entire camera lineup, but they need sufficient volume to justify large amounts of R&D. If a camera manufacturer's market shrinks, the amount of R&D they can put in also needs to drop, and that means they might not be able to keep up with the competition. But as their market share shrinks, they also need to raise their prices to cover that fixed R&D cost, and at some point, a company can no longer be profitable and compete at a given price point. For so many years, Micro Four Thirds was a choice of people who needed something small and light. Hikers, landscape photographers, travelers. But we've seen Sony and Canon take that on directly. Canon's 800mm f11 wildlife lens is amazing, produces amazing results in a form factor pretty much identical to stuff from Micro Four Thirds, and it's $800 at a similar price. That was a direct attack from Canon on especially the Olympus wildlife users. Sony's A7C is a full-frame camera, but it's the size of Micro Four Thirds and APS-C cameras. That's them cutting in to those smaller markets, trying to starve out the smaller competitors. And I'm afraid that strategy just might work. We even have Panasonic, who's leveraging their brand equity, their loyal user base, but trying to pull everybody to the full-frame L-mount system, because after all, it's going to make a lot of sense for them to consolidate their offerings to reduce the number of cameras that they have so they can focus their R&D and marketing budget on a smaller number of offerings. So reviewing my 2018 predictions about the future of Micro Four Thirds 3 years later, I think it was right on track. I accurately predicted Olympus exiting the camera business, as well as the continually reduced R&D effort in the Micro Four Thirds platforms, and I do stand behind it. I'm excited to see the GH5 Mark II. I think it's going to be a capable and exciting camera for existing Micro Four Thirds users, but do I think it's going to cause anybody to sell their Canon, Nikon, Sony gear and move to Micro Four Thirds? That doesn't seem likely. But nonetheless, we would love to support those of you who are shooting Micro Four Thirds. And thank you to our sponsor, Squarespace. No matter what type of website you need, go to squarespace.com/Tony. You don't have to be a nerd to set up a website anymore. You can make an amazing website that works great on computers, tablets, mobile devices, all this complex stuff. They take care of it for you and they make it beautiful. Because not only do they have super nerds, but they have super designers who know how to match colors, choose fonts, use typography and iconography to make your brand perfect. Try it out for free at squarespace.com/Tony, and if you love it, use the coupon code Tony for 10% off. Thank you, Squarespace. In the comments down below, I want to know what you think of the GH5 Mark II specs. Is this something you're interested in, or is this the last straw from you? If the GH6 isn't on the horizon with 8K and 30 megapixels, are you ready to sell all your stuff? Maybe to KEH? Thanks, bye.